Now I want you to think for a moment about that little concluding remark. Thus, the last will be first, and the first will be last. This is what preachers do, folks. They tell you a story, then they hit you with the punchline. So for Matthew, the punchline is, thus, the last will be first, and the first will be last. That's how Matthew understood the parable. This concluding remark, the last will be first, the first will be last, happens to be a very common punchline in the Gospels. It isn't a bad idea. It appears all over the Bible, the Hebrew Scriptures. You see those kinds of reversals, right? All over the place. The only problem is this, that it is on this parable in Matthew, but it's stuck to a different parable in Mark. And it's stuck to a different parable in Luke. Well, what it tells you is, brother, that the first will be last and the last will be first was an all-purpose punchline. If you don't really get the story, you just stick it on there. That'll maybe make it work. Preachers can use it whenever they want it, whenever they need it. You need an all-purpose punchline? Just remember, the last will be first and the first will be last. The fact that Matthew has chosen to hang this punchline on the ending of this parable, the parable of the day laborers in the vineyard, means that in his mind, what this parable is all about is that the last will be first and the first will be last. You know, the idea that the last will be first and the first will be last ain't bad ideas. I mean, that's a fairly common idea found throughout the Bible. It's a good thought. I like it. I think it's great. You know, does it have anything really to do with this parable in its earlier pre-Matthean form? That's very doubtful. But Matthew had the problem of needing to preach it. So like any good preacher, he gives his audience a good old all-purpose punchline. What's the moral of the story? The last will be first, and the first will be last. Matthew, have you ever picked grain?
No.
No, you're a scribe, right? Where do you fall in the socioeconomic breakdown of Jesus' society?
Top 2%.
So you haven't been picking grain, have you, Matthew? The last will be first and the first will be last is not bad as good as punchlines go. I'm not knocking it. It just does not have anything to do with this story in the pre-Matthean form. It was added later. So how has this story usually been interpreted in the Western world? First off, the conclusion of Matthew, which obviously misses the point, is usually and has usually been ignored by commentators for a long time, centuries. People trained in classic Greek would read the story and go, that doesn't belong there. So how do you deal with that if you're a classic Christian scholar? Just ignore it. We're not going to talk about that. However, much the last may be first and the first will be last may have meant to the Jesus group called Matthew's Jesus group, the Matthean Jesus group, the one he preached to. Most biblical commentators throughout Western history have simply ignored it, feeling that it was an inappropriate addition to the story. Secondly, throughout Western history, the almost unanimous interpretation of this parable is God treats everyone equally and is even superabundant in graciousness to those who come in later or last. This idea has led to a rather curious practice in early Christian times and throughout the Middle Ages. People would delay getting baptized and try to confess all their sins on their deathbed. Because the last will be first, and the first will be last. So imagine you're living a terrible scumbag life, and then at the very end, Emperor Constantine, don't get baptized. Because the ancient people, they very much were concerned when the moment they're going to die. Americans, no. That's the last. We are so artificial in this country, we put death off all the time with endless distractions. But the ancient person, they couldn't do that. They didn't have the leisure to do that. So they wanted to know when exactly was they were going to die. Because if they could know when they were going to die, then they could rush and get all their sins confessed right there on the deathbed. They could live real nice, okay? Screwing everybody over, and then at the very end, I confess all these things. Whew! Gets paid just like the first workers, the workers of the saints that have been working all their life.
And you go to Sky Vault.
And you go right to Sky Vault. That's right. Sounds good to me. So it's doubtful that Americans like us want to know the time of our death. We put that off. But Christians in ancient times ardently wanted to know the moment of their death so they could get baptized and they could confess all their sins right before they croaked. See? Yeah, that's right. So see what they figured? God was going to treat them just like the landowner treated the workers at the end of the day. Yeah. You could live your life in filthy depravity and cruelty right up to the last second. And then you enjoy the reward of those saints who had spent their entire lives in faithful, pious self-denial. So ancient Christians reading this story encouraged deathbed baptisms and deathbed confessions. By the way, our sacrament of anointing of the sick, we used to be called extreme unction, right? Because of this and the last rites and all that, right? I remember watching a Murder, She Wrote. The guy dies, he's like trying to get his confession out. Oh, he died before the confession. And Catholics still to this day, that's the worst thing that could happen. Right, because God works like you know, if Billy Batson can't say Shazam, God's going to have a problem. I mean, this is ridiculous. Most interpreters in the West have understood the first day laborers in the parable as ingrates, often seen as being opponents to Jesus. What more do they want anyway? I mean, they're getting their daily wage. These freaking ungrateful people. Right. They got their usual daily pay. All they do is moan, kvetch, and complain. Oh, they must be the Jews. That's how a lot of Western commentators have treated this parable. What's extremely common in Western history is to interpret the first workers as the ungrateful Jews who did not like the kingdom being extended to include the latecomers, us Gentiles. In other words, much of Western interpretation has turned this parable into an allegory that is anti-Semitic. Here we go again. It is astonishing when you read Western interpretations of Jesus' parables throughout history how many of them are turned into anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish rants. This parable is just one of many examples. However, since non-Israelites did not join the Jesus groups until long after the death and resurrection of Jesus, that cannot have been Jesus' idea. All anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish interpretations of this parable are utter nonsense.